I started at White Labs when I was almost just out of college, and it was sort of a fluke that I got the job there. But as soon as I found out what I would be doing, I thought, this is going to be awesome. So it was sort of a match made in heaven from the beginning. I've always really enjoyed beer, and I started homebrewing pretty much right after I started. We started in 1995. Chris White started the company after his PhD work at UC San Diego. He was studying an industrial strain of yeast then for some antibody research that they were doing there. It was a strain called Pichia pastoris. And at the time, he started getting interested in homebrewing. He went down to Home Brew Mart in San Diego, met up with the guys there, learned how to homebrew. After a while, they started talking, and they were like, oh, you grow yeast? He was like, yeah. Hey, maybe you could grow this yeast for us. So he took the yeast back to his laboratory at UCSD, grew up a bunch of vials so that they could sell it at the store, and it sold out in the same day or the same weekend, and so they kept asking him to make more yeast. And after a while, he decided that it would be a good idea to start a business where he just grew and sold liquid yeast. We recently moved our facility to a new facility last June, so we've been there almost a year. And with the new facility, one of the points that we really were hoping to focus on was more research and development, more strain development and things like that. So we thought it would be a great way to showcase our yeast by having a tasting room. So that's something that's been open for the past few months. We started brewing back in March, and we've got 32 taps in the tasting room, plus a beer engine with 3 taps. And what we're doing is all experimental brews. We've got a 20-gallon brewing system, and we're doing one batch and then splitting those into multiple 5-gallon fermentations where we can use different strains. So the only difference is the yeast strain. So it's been a really great tool for people to come in and really be able to taste the differences between the strains. And that's something that I'm kind of going to talk about today. Why the yeasts are different, what makes the strains differences, and also how you can influence a strain by the different conditions that it undergoes. So I'm going to quickly go through this PowerPoint, but my goal is really just to be here to answer questions. So I'm going to go through the presentation quickly, and then hopefully if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask me. So very, very basically, what is yeast? Yeast has been really important in the biotechnology industry for many years because of its complex metabolic processes. It makes it's very similar to humans in the way that it operates, and that's why it's been so widely studied for different types of antibody research and things like that too. So it's a fungus. I think most of us know that by now. And there are several different species of concern to fermentation, and I've listed those here: Saccharomyces cerevisiae, Pastorianus, and Biennis. So those are the 3 main classifications of yeast that we use today. The top 2, the Cerevisiae and the Pastorianus, are the ones that are mainly used in brewing. And this is just basically a diagram of the yeast cell and why it's so complex. Just like humans, it's got organs, and the organs perform a variety of functions, so very similar to us. The 2 main classifications on the species level: ale yeast, lager yeast. It's pretty basic information, and really what makes them different, of course, are the fermentation temperatures. Lagers prefer cooler temperatures, ales prefer warmer temperatures. Additionally, the different flavor byproducts that they produce make them part of each class. Lager yeast can also ferment raffinose, which ale yeast can't. So there are some very minor differences among the 2 species, which is why they're separated this way. And as far as strain, I get this question a lot. What makes a strain unique? What's the difference between these 2 strains? Because they are the same species, that's true. But the way I kind of explain it to people is that yeast are like humans. While we're all the same species, we're all very unique, and that's how the strains are. And part of that has to do with how we were brought up, so environmental conditions, and also part of our gene makeup. that are very minute differences, but also contribute to, like hair color, eye color, things like that. So yeast are the same way. For instance, this is a gel electrophoresis. It's what we would normally use to look at genetic patterns in a yeast strain. And I've got 2 ale yeasts here, and you can see the different banding patterns. They're very similar, but there are a few minor differences, which I've kind of circled here, so that you can see, and this is just a clip of the actual genetic makeup too. The rest of it is all sequenced, and it's exactly the same, except for these 2 patterns right here. This is actually a piece of art that we're going to be hanging up in the tasting room. And it's not going to look like this exactly. This was just a raw image, but because we really like science and we really love yeast, we're doing this DNA art from a local company in California. So they're doing all that for us. It'll be really cool. Beyond that, beyond the species level, there's these strain classifications. And these classes that I'm describing here actually come from George Fix. I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with his work. He did a lot of research on the science side, wrote several books about it, and he's the one that really developed these classifications. What makes ale yeasts different? So the first class that he describes are these California ale yeast, Kolsch yeast kind of strains. Really clean fermenters, produce really low levels of esters, fairly flocculent strains of yeast, and they're very versatile. Because they're so clean, they can be used for a large variety of beers. The class 2 strains, he calls British and English strains. Really flocculent strains, they produce quite a bit of diacetyl, and so they generally tend to make a little bit maltier beers because they flocculate and drop out very quickly. So that's very characteristic of strains in this class. The class 3 strains, now he further divides these into 2 groups. The 3A are the Hefeweizen wheat beer strains and classic phenolic banana non-flocculators. So very typical of those strains. And then the class B Belgian strains. And again, very similar in flavor profile. These generally tend to be a little bit more on the phenolic side because they're considered to be more wild than most of the other strains that we would use on ales. And again, pretty non-flocculent. The last type on the lager yeast, he divides these only into 2 groups. And one is just the American lager yeast strains, which is a little interesting because he doesn't really include the steam lager yeast, which ferments at a little bit warmer temperatures compared to most lagers. But American lager yeast and then the German style lager yeast. And again, very clean fermenting, cool temperatures, may produce some sulfur compounds, so very classic for these kinds of styles. So as far as the White Lab strains go, I kind of use this chart as just an example when you're selecting a strain. Based on the properties that I kind of discussed before under different classifications, what yeast strains would be appropriate for different styles. And this is basically a rating system that's used here, 0 being the least appropriate for that style and 4 being the most appropriate. So you can see the differences kind of going across the board. I only listed a few styles here. English Pale IPA, American Pale, American IPA, Scottish, Irish, and German Alt. And this is just an example of some things that we have on our website to help brewers choose what strains to use based on characteristics that we know that are particular for those strains. And each one is going to have a slightly different ester profile, slightly different fusel profile, diacetyl, flocculation. So depending on the style of beer you're going to make, the strain choice is very important because it will affect the final outcome. You don't want to be using, let's say, WLP 002. You probably don't want to use that for an IPA because it's not going to be very dry. It's going to drop out too quickly, and also it leaves a lot of residual diacetyl in the beer, so it's not really appropriate for that style of beer. It would be more appropriate for NESB, something that would be a little maltier and could retain a little diacetyl, because that's typical of a lot of English style beers. Furthermore, not only choosing the right yeast, but how you treat that yeast is going to affect the beer. So conditional factors. And I listed here only these three: pitch rate, dissolved oxygen, and nutrients. There are many other things. Temperature is one of them. So a lot of different things, but I wanted to focus on these because I think there's a fair amount of debate about these three and what's appropriate, and they do have a great effect on how the yeast perform. Pitching rate, I'll talk about this. The general rule of thumb that everyone knows is the 1 million cells per mil per degree Plato. And, is that always going to be the case? Not necessarily. Again, it's going to depend on what you're looking for in the final beer. I did a high gravity beer, one batch, split them up, and I pitched them at different rates. The first set I pitched at 10 million cells per mil, 20 million cells per mil, 30 million cells, and 40 million cells. And what this basically shows is that it started at about 19 Plato, and the gravity by the end dropped to just under 5 Plato in the same amount of time. So regardless of whether I pitched it at 10 million cells or 40 million cells, I was able to achieve about the same final gravity. And I stopped them at this point. They could have gone a little further too, but what does this really tell us? You can underpitch the beer and still get it to ferment out to dryness. But the big difference is this slide right here. The blue part is how many cells I actually pitched. The pink part that's above that is how many new cells were generated over the course of the fermentation. So you can see when the beer was underpitched at 10 million cells, I had a much greater growth rate percentage than I did when I pitched at 40 million cells. It's 244% at 10 million compared to only 52% in the increase in cell mass over the fermentation period. So that means if we pitch less, we encourage more growth. If we pitch more, we encourage less growth. And in terms of flavor production, that means a lot. Because with a lot more cell growth, you're getting a lot more metabolic activity, so you're getting a lot more flavor production. If you're looking to make a beer that's got tons of yeast character, then you do want to underpitch slightly. If you want to make something very clean, and then pitching more is going to help you achieve that. And again, it's going to be in combination with other things, maintaining the fermentation temperatures, the gravity, all those are going to affect the final outcome. But this is part of it too. With something like this, I say that 1 million cells per mil per degree Plato kind of goes out the window. You really have the option to pitch what you want, as long as you know what the end result is going to be. So dissolved oxygen. In professional circles, it's been well known that you want to achieve a dissolved oxygen rate of 8 to 10 parts per million. What does that mean? It's a measurement, and most commercial breweries don't even have a way to measure this. So how can you at home really know what you're adding and if that's going to be enough? And oxygen is obviously very important for the yeast. The yeast need it to help build lipids, which it needs to make cell membranes, which it needs to grow more yeast. So it's critical that it has enough oxygen. Again, another experiment where I did oxygenation from a pure O2 tank, and I did it for differing amounts of time. And I also measured the dissolved oxygen rate at those times. So this kind of gives you a baseline for how much you can be oxygenating and what you're achieving. And this is based on an almost 19 Plato word. So I did 0 seconds, no oxygen, and that gave me about 2.5 parts per million of dissolved oxygen. 30 seconds gave me about 5, 1 minute about 9, and then I did 2 minutes of pure O2 to get about 14 parts per million.
On the 0 second column, is that just the ambient oxygen from transporting
Yep.
into the car?
Exactly. No, yeah, nothing was added. And in this case, there is a big difference in the final gravities. The ones that I didn't oxygenate at all are 1 Plato point higher than the ones that were oxygenated at the right levels. this does make a big impact. And I had talked yesterday about how this compares to air, like using air versus oxygen. Shaking works too. Somebody mentioned yesterday aquarium pump, which is kind of nice because you can just set it and forget it without all the shaking. But obviously that takes more time. What I found with aquarium pump is about 25 minutes will get you to the right level. With shaking, it's probably 15 to 20. But it's so important. You gotta do it. It's good exercise.
So you're saying you can get up to that, like 14 parts per million with shaking and or an oxygen or aquarium pump?
You can, but it's gonna be longer. And it's also a little bit harder. Up to about 14, 15 is generally gonna work with just air. Otherwise, you'd have to pressurize it to keep the oxygen dissolved in there because it'll just blow off. Well, the thing is, this is a higher gravity beer. Normally that 8 to 10 parts per million is recommended for your average gravity wort, like 12 to 14 Plato. So this is a bit higher, which is why I kind of went into the higher range too, just to kind of see how it would affect the fermentation. And if you kind of look at the numbers starting from 0 down, the one that had the 14 parts per million did drop faster because it's sitting at 16.9 compared to 17.5 in the 9 parts per million. So it does get there a bit quicker. But in the end, you know, having at least 8 parts per million is where you want to be. And then nitrogen, nutrition, including nitrogen, I'll talk about a bit. If you're doing all malt brewing, it's really not as necessary to add nitrogen as a source because most malted barley, when it's converted, has plenty of nutrients in it, including a lot of nitrogen. So unless you're doing higher gravity beer or you're using a lot of adjuncts, you probably don't need to do a nutrient. You can get just DAP for the nitrogen content if you need to. But on the Saccharomyces topic, zinc is one component that is missing from brewer's wort typically because the conversion just doesn't allow carryover that's actual usable zinc. It's usually bound, which the yeast can't take up. So an added zinc addition is pretty important. Saccharomyces is a product you can use. It's an active yeast that's been grown on a zinc-rich medium, so it's readily available to the yeast at all times. Other products like zinc sulfate you can add as well. And zinc is really important. It's sort of one of those underrated nutrients because people aren't really quite sure what it does, but they know that it's good. And basically what zinc does is it's a cofactor that allows an enzyme during fermentation called alcohol dehydrogenase to convert acetaldehyde into ethanol. So the ultimate goal is to make alcohol, and zinc is important if you want to make sure that that conversion happens completely. And then I listed other metal ions too, such as magnesium. Again, cofactors in a lot of enzyme reactions that are going to assist with glycolysis and the breakdown of sugars. As a summary, how do these conditions actually affect the yeast? What's the final outcome? What's the result? And this is a general kind of rule of thumb. It's not always going to be the case because it will depend on other factors too. Like I mentioned, temperature before will have a lot of effect on some of these things. But in general, higher gravity means you're going to increase metabolic activity because there's a lot more sugars present. The yeast are feeding really frantically, and so as a result, they'll create a lot more fusels and esters. So typically your higher gravity beers, barley wines and things like that will have a lot of fusels and a lot of esters, and that's because there's so much sugar present. And then this sort of goes hand in hand with the higher gravity, the higher metabolic activity, the more flavor byproducts are being produced. Now, these last two are kind of interesting. Higher pitching rate will result in lower diacetyl and lower fusels because you've got a lot of yeast already in there. And as I said earlier, if you have a lot of yeast, you're not encouraging a lot of growth. So there's low growth rate resulting in lower acetaldehyde and lower fusel alcohol production. However, you will see higher ester production. And that sort of goes against the norm a little bit or sounds like it does, but a compound called acetyl-CoA, I don't expect you to remember this, I won't test you on it, is responsible for yeast metabolism and also ester formation. So if yeast is in growth phase, this compound is directed towards growth. When yeast isn't in growth phase, the compound is now free, so it'll be directed towards formation of esters. So that's why you see that kind of inverse relationship. So also, higher oxygen actually increases acetaldehyde formation and fusel formation, but decreases esters because the oxygen is going to promote yeast to grow, and as the yeast is growing, the acetyl-CoA is going to be focused at helping the yeast grow rather than making esters. And that's it for the formal presentation, and I would encourage you guys, if you have any questions, to ask me now or forever hold your peace.
How many breweries do you supply with yeast?
To be honest, I don't know exactly. And I don't even know what percentage of the market we have compared to other yeast suppliers. It would be really difficult to tell that because a lot of people will use both companies. Well, when I say both, you know, Y Yeast and us. And then there's also BSI in Colorado. So those are kind of the three main players, and it's just hard to say. And you know, there are customers that we have that will buy a few things from us and a lot of things from the other guys, and vice versa. They'll buy a lot of things from us and a few things from other guys. So, you know, we have a good percentage of business. We've definitely grown over the last few years. So.
Do you guys take special requests, like we want the yeast to do this, this, and this, and then I wouldn't even know how you would begin through some form of genetic manipulation or something like that?
We don't do any genetics on the yeast, no genetic modification. Most of that is because I think that a lot of people don't trust that, and I don't know how many breweries would actually use it if we brought in a GMO product. So everything that we have is a natural mutation of some fermentation or another. We have had people call in and request that a strain do a certain thing. If they want it to flocculate more, for instance, we can do that. We can select for that. We don't do any modifications, but we'll run fermentations, and then we'll select the ones that have the most flocculent properties, and then we'll take that and kind of grow it up. So that's how we do it, just by selection, and that's sort of a more natural process.
Can you accomplish anything along those lines by blending strains?
Yeah, and that's what we've started doing more of too, because you know, we're constantly trying to grow the yeast bank, trying to add new strains, and how do we really do that without adding more strains that we already have, like similar to what we already have. So one way we've been able to achieve that is by doing blends of strains, because those are unique, and those are unique to us. It's not like you can go to another place and get the same exact blend that we make, because that information is proprietary. Because, you know, single strains, sure, you can get it off the shelf. Everybody's got, you know, really similar strains, but the blends are unique. And we can formulate a blend to, you know, result in certain fermentation properties. For instance, the Saison yeast that we carry, 565, is notoriously terrible for not finishing. It's a great yeast. A lot of great flavor products from that yeast. People really like it, but it's a very difficult strain to use if you don't know how to use it. So what we decided to do a few years back was take that strain, blend it with something that was dry, so that you could still get a lot of the flavor buildup from it, but then also get another yeast strain that would finish out the fermentation.
So if those are like 80-20 mix kind of things, do they grow proportionally? Or like do you kind of lose control over what?
You eventually lose control, yeah. But over the first couple of generations, there's not a lot of change. But over time, the populations will change significantly. So, you know, depending on how long you want to use it, most commercial breweries, if they do buy a blend, will only use it 1 or 2 times. It'll be for something really special, a one-off or something like that.
I know some of the strains, right, have other bacteria in them too. How do those sort of interact?
Yep, the bacteria and Brett strains still very similar over the course of the first or 1 or 2 generations typically, but yeah, eventually the more hardy strains are going to take over, and the Saccharomyces strain that's in there is not one of them. The Brett strains will take over because they grow much faster at a faster rate than the Saccharomyces yeast, and they're hardier, so they last a long time, and the number of viable cells that you have far exceeds whatever Saccharomyces is in the population. So generally, what people see if they do use those over time is that the beer tends to get more and more sour, ethyl acetate from the Brett strains. So.
Now this is a kind of a beginner's question. I assume yeast replicates by cell division. So when you say blended, that's truly 2 different strains kind of coexisting together,
Yes.
not some hybrid.
No,
Okay.
no, they're not hybridized. Brewer's yeast is pretty unique in that it's what's called a polyploid organism, which means that there are 4 sets of chromosomes. So it's a little more complex. There are a lot of other yeasts and bacteria that are simpler, diploid or haploid, which means 1 or 2, and those can cross very easily and change. Brewer's yeast don't do that, so they're very difficult to get to actually change their genetic makeup. Because you can cross some organisms, and brewing yeast just isn't one of them. The biggest differences that result from temperature changes are the byproduct production. At higher temperatures, you're going to produce more. It's going to encourage more ester production, for instance, and fusel alcohol production. At lower temperature ranges, the fermentation tends to be cleaner because you're kind of suppressing the pathways that produce these other byproducts. So, the yeast will live in quite a variable temperature range, but what they're producing as a result of that is really what changes.
So is your recommended temperature range based on the profile that you're sort of selling with the?
Yeah, exactly. A lot of the Belgian strains, for example, are higher because, typically you want to promote those yeast characters in beer, so you want to ferment them a little bit warmer. Whereas some of the cleaner strains like Kolsch, we recommend keeping fairly low, 64, 66, I think. To maintain that at a low level and also minimize some of the sulfur production. And the thing to remember too with fluctuations over time is the yeast are producing these flavor byproducts really within the first about 48 hours of fermentation. And so beyond that, you're really just getting like cleanup of diacetyl and acetaldehyde and other things, not so much throwing off these other compounds.
Is there anything you can publicly announce about anything coming up? Product-wise?
Like what?
I don't know.
We're trying to hold more products, different products that relate to fermentation. We've had the line of enzymes out for a while now, and we're actually adding a couple new ones for this year that we'll have ready for NHC. And most of that is, we've got a pectinase enzyme for fruit fermentations. We've got one that's coming out that's specifically for pumpkin beers, things like that, breaking down some of the fibrous pulp. So those kinds of things. And, really we're just trying to do more on the educational side. That's a big part of what we want to do in the future. Right now we've got several seminars on the books, but we want to get things scheduled out for next year and be able to incorporate more of that. So. And we're always open to suggestions on, not only yeast products, other products, classes, anything. I'd like to get feedback because we don't always know what people want, and it's important to talk to consumers.
Neva, now you guys do your big QC day, but then did you open that up for homebrewers as well too?
Big QC day has always been open to homebrewers, but I don't think it's been advertised to homebrewers. If you guys don't know of the program, we run it twice a year now. The next one's coming up in August, and it is an opportunity for small brewers and homebrewers to get a bunch of analytical testing done on 2 beers for a really, really discounted price. And the way that we're able to do that is by taking in all the samples at once and just running all the tests. So we have I don't know, 500 samples, and then we'll do it all at once. So we can really reduce the price by doing a lot of samples together. And the cost for that is $139 for 2 beer samples, and the range of tests you get include alcohol, IBU, diacetyl, micro testing, contaminant testing, and then all the specs that go along with it. pH, extract values, calories, and haze. So all of that is included for 2 samples at $139, and it typically would cost about $500 to get all of that done for 1 sample. So it's
Send that in, or do they have
yes.
to come in person?
No, you can send it in. What we do is you order online, we send you a kit, and the kit has 2 bottles. You fill the bottles, it's all barcoded, you enter your information online, send it back to us, we do all the testing, and then the reports come out online. So you can pull them up when they're done. It's really a great tool for people that don't have access to it or can't afford it. I mean, it's very expensive to get the analysis done, but it's kind of fun if you want to get an idea for, you know, some of those tests on your beer. So it's 2 samples. And another new thing that we'll be offering very soon is an alcohol, we call it an alcohol test kit. That'll be at NHC too, but it's another kit for 1 beer sample. It comes in a box, you can buy it online again, and it includes shipping. It's $30, and it includes shipping back to us. And you can get alcohol, all the ABV values for that price. And same sort of deal, you go online, enter your barcode, enter the information for the beer, submit it, and you can also purchase additional tests with that, so you can kind of customize it to what you want. You can get IBU, diacetyl, all the ones that I mentioned before as an add-on. And then same thing. When the results are in, we just email you and you can pull up the report online. And you know, we've been trying for some time now to promote some of our analysis to homebrewers, but also make it affordable, because you know, nobody wants to spend a couple $100s to get something tested for fun. So trying to keep the price range so that it's affordable for people to be able to do.
I was wondering about cell replication or generations of yeast from batch to batch. As far as I'm aware, it's usually about 10 to 15 or so is what most people might be able to do with the lens. But are there ways where you can promote a healthier replication of these cells to even extend that? Yeah,
absolutely. You know, I always tell people this. We recommend generally about 10 generations for ale yeast, but that's not the end of it. It all depends on yeast handling and how well you treat the yeast over that time. If you do everything just right and the yeast are very happy, it can go 50 generations, 100 generations. So it really depends on handling. And most of that has to do with storage of the yeast, how it's being stored, and just how healthy they are before they go into storage. So things like harvesting the yeast very soon after the end of fermentation, allowing it to not undergo too many stresses during fermentation, which is sometimes hard to do, but you know, having a moderate gravity beer that you're fermenting at and then just carrying it on, and trying not to store it for too long amount of time. You want to keep it under 2 weeks if you can, and storing it cold. So all of those things are really going to help you to be able to get more generations out of the yeast. And you know, I really like things like washing yeast with sterile water, because you can remove a lot of trub from the yeast. Some is okay, but you know, there's a lot of hop trub and things like that too, hop residue that you want to kind of rinse off. And if you have done a higher gravity fermentation and you collect the yeast, you want to rinse off that beer, because you don't want it sitting under too much alcohol. Anything over 6%, you probably want to remove from the yeast if you're going to store it. So there's a lot of ways that you can help it along, and that'll help you, you know, get as many generations as you can out of it.
Brewer and CD a few episodes back talked about like a lager strain that you could do at warmer temperatures to get some fun results with. Are there other kind of, do you know particular strains that are fun to get outside the balance of?
Sure, yeah. I mean, there's the traditional steam lager yeast, which normally ferments warm, but almost any lager strain will ferment warm. But the reason that they're usually kept cold is because they're cleaner at cold temperatures, and they're capable of doing that. Ale yeasts at those temperatures, they just won't go. So that's what's unique about lagers. They'll ferment cold, they like it cold, but they'll ferment warm. The big difference is, again, at the warmer temperatures, it's gonna produce more ester compounds and more sulfur if it's a lager yeast that produces sulfur. So you can do it. I know a commercial brewery in San Diego that uses the lager yeast for their beer to guard instead of an ale yeast.
Since you guys do so much experimenting at work, if you had to pick one, what's your favorite yeast strain?
It's so funny that you asked that. I was just talking about this yesterday, how that is always the number one question that I get. We have a lot of yeast strains, I have two that I really like that I'll tell you about. I had to narrow it down. The first one is our Edinburgh Ale Yeast 028. I like it because it's a really good alternative to California Ale. Everyone likes to use that. It's a great strain, it's a workhorse. But if you want something a little bit different, I like Edinburgh. It's still, if you ferment it on the cool end of the range, it's still very clean, so it's great for pales, IPAs, things like that. If you want something that's got a little bit more yeast character, you can ferment it a little warmer, maybe an amber or brown, something like that. So it's actually very versatile, and it has a wide temperature range that you can play around with to make different styles, and I really like that one. The other strain I really like is a Platinum 510. And what I like about it is that for a Belgian strain, it's our best own yeast. It's actually very clean. I love Belgian beers, but sometimes I don't like it when they're too estery because I just feel like it's cloying, and I want to be able to drink like a couple of beers instead of just having half a pint and being sick of it. So I really like the 510 because it actually ferments fairly clean, but it's got this weird tart acidic finish that I just really like, and I just think makes it really interesting.
Have you had some new strains that are coming out that maybe you haven't had before?
Yes. We added 5 new strains to the Platinum series for this year, and that was because we took 5 from last year, and those are year-round now. I can't remember what's out now. There's a new Brettanomyces strain I think is out now.
I think so.
And there will also be a Flemish ale blend that will be out later this year. I'm trying to think now off the top of my head what else is new. We had a new lager strain, and then we reintroduced the French ale strain that was not part of Platinum last year, but was the year before. So there's that, and then there's the Mysterious X, which we will be releasing at NHC.
How many, vial cells come in your vials?
How many actual cells?
Yeah.
Ours are about 1.5 billion cells per mil.
Okay.
So in one vial, it's 35 mils at 1.5. 1.5 to 2 billion cells. It depends on the strain and the size of the cells because we just go by cell pack. So some strains will be on the lower end, like 002 because the cells are larger, so we can't get as many cells in there. And then other strains like Hef or Trappist, there will be quite a bit more, over 2 billion, because they're so small.
Any tips on that? I mean, I've heard it ferments better cooler, like the old 60s.
It does well in a wide range. The thing that I found with that strain is that it's very oxygen dependent. It needs a lot of oxygen, so you might want to give it a little bit more. It's also a funny one because it doesn't create as much of a Krausen as like 001 does in comparison. It's still a very clean fermenter, but it doesn't look like it ferments as vigorously, so you won't get that huge Krausen at the top. In fact, the first time I used it, I did side-by-side comparisons, and I was like, I don't think it's working. It doesn't look like it's fermenting at all. But it was fermenting at the same rate, and it finished faster than Cal. It just didn't look like it. So it doesn't create a lot of blow-off, which is kind of nice. But lots of oxygen.
Have you seen a lot of inquiries about Clarity Firm in terms of gluten reduction? I know that's kind of a hot topic in
Yes.
gluten beers.
Yes, and Clarity Firm is an interesting product. It's primarily it's not intended for gluten-free. It's a chill haze reducer, and it works great for that. As a side, it also prevents the bonding of the compounds that make gluten. So it reduces it in that sense. And we have done a lot of trials and will continue to do them because it is such a sensitive topic, and to ensure that the information we're putting out there is correct. We're not making any claims that it's necessarily going to make a gluten-free beer, but it will reduce the gluten in any beer that we make. And it's kind of tricky. The TTB has recently come out with a statement regarding labeling of gluten-free beers that are processed to reduce gluten, because the gluten test hasn't been a validated method by FDA. And what they mean by that is when we're testing for it, we're actually testing for a compound called gliadin, which we can do with a little kit. And that makes up about half. That times 2 is what the gluten level would be. So you're not measuring gluten itself, but the precursor to gluten. So that has to be validated first by the FDA before we can really make any claims of that sort. So people are allowed to label beer that's made with barley as only being processed or crafted to reduce gluten. It can't be labeled gluten-free. Even though before, as long as it was under 20 ppm, you could say it was gluten-free. It's sort of it's a little bit of a complicated topic, and we don't want to get involved in anything where we're going to get people in trouble. So, well, thank you guys all so much for coming and for listening to me jabber on about yeast. If you want more information, my email address is there or on our website. We have a lot of information there too, and we're in the process of revamping our website. So if you have trouble finding anything, let me know. I'd love to get feedback on that, as well as any other classes or products that you would like to see us carry. And if you're ever in San Diego, come by the tasting room, taste all the different yeasts that we have on the tap line and in our cask. Thank you.